Everybody, hope you're doing well. Together with my co-authors Abby Diller and Jared Moore, we are very excited to bring you our work on generative art via grammatical evolution. Before I move on, thank you once again for having us and for allowing us to present remotely. This is a wonderful opportunity. So, if you have never heard of the field of generative art, I highly recommend you check out Daniel Schiffman's work on the coding train. This is what got me into it. If you don't know, generative art is a great place to take all of your algorithmic mathematical knowledge and translate it into something aesthetically pleasing. Um, Minimally for a great way to blow off stress, and it has, for me, turned into something which is, interestingly enough, a research area. So for us, we are interested in this generative art field, and we really wanted to bring evolutionary computation into that. So that's kind of the whole purpose for this work. Now, if you're not familiar with generative art, basically it's a great way to visualize anything, algorithms, data sets, mathematical functions, basically anything that we can represent internally to a program, you can make it look aesthetically pleasing. Now, the pictures I've got here on the screen, this one on the left is kind of a standard hello world in a way for the P5.js library, which if you're not familiar with P5, to back up a step, it is a great JavaScript library for learning creative coding, for introducing people to JavaScript, or even common programming practices. Um, for us, it makes drawing things very, very, very easy. Interestingly, we did this whole thing in Python, but that was for other reasons. Anyway, so this image here is a visualization of a sine wave. So basically your standard y equals amplitude times sine x, right? And if we were to move ahead a slide here, this is an animated version. And for P5.js, this is a very trivial program to write. And I've got the link here for you to check out if you're interested in. Basically, this is a great way to introduce coding concepts for new and experienced users alike. So you will very often see generative art in the areas of creative coding. So basically showing artists, interactive media, um, K through 12 students how to program. Lots of different ways that you could take this. Could be art, could be games, but it's a great way to basically get people into coding or expressing themselves via coding. Other areas that you will see this typically are in real world interactive displays. So you will often see um, lovely interactive displays where people will interact with sensors and the display will change or it will react to some data set that it's consuming. Basically, there are a lot of really interesting ways that you can take this. Now, the sine wave that I showed you here, we glitched with a pixel sorting algorithm. So basically, we took this particular image, froze it in time, and applied a pixel sorting algorithm. And basically, what pixel sorting does is it will run a sorting algorithm on the pixel values on the screen or in a particular area, and it will sort them according to some value that you specify. Could be an average of the red, green, blue values. You could be going to the the transparency values. It could be any specific color value or anything on the in the pixel array really that you want to sort by. And what that does is it gives you this interesting kind of glitchy effect. And I'll show you another one further on. But basically, our goal here was to take some of these techniques and include them into a evolutionary project, right? So with generative arts, the techniques that we included were stippling, cellular automata, circle packing, flow fields, drunkard's walk, dithering, pixel sorting. Essentially, these are all algorithms that myself and my research team were interested in. Okay. And the goal of this project would be to make it that any technique that anybody wanted to include would be viable. Maybe somebody really likes watercolor drawings. We could have a technique for drawing a watercolor on top of the existing canvas, right? And all they would have to do is figure out how to do that in a artistic sense, or at least in an algorithmic sense, and include it in the library. It would then be part of this algorithm. Okay. So anyway, these techniques, stippling is one way for basically drawing a series of tiny dots on a piece of paper or on a canvas, and you get this either gradient or textured effect. Basically, it's filling space with dots. You might have seen like pointillism styles of art in the past where people will recreate an image using essentially tiny little circles. So it's a great way to add texture to a piece. Cellular automata, if you've ever heard of Conway's Game of Life, that's an automata. Basically, it's a simple, very simple algorithm where you kind of move through an image, and based on your neighboring cells, your current cell will either be filled or empty, or it will have, whichever value you want to place in there. And then you kind of get outputs that look kind of like this, lots of recursive triangles. This is fractalish in a way. Um, this is one of the Wolfram kind of demo rule sets, but there are many ways that you could take this. Essentially, it's a rule-based heuristic. Okay, another one that's fun to do is circle packing. So the goal here is to fill as many circles as possible into a space without having them overlap. So you get lots of circles of different sizes trying to fill a space without bumping into each other, basically. And you can get some very interesting outputs for that. We also have two versions of flow fields. I'll show you a live demo of that in a moment. Two versions because we had two different people who really liked flow fields in this project. Basically, all this really is is visualizing movement through a noise field. So in this case here, I'll use this bigger image. We have a 2D array of noise values, and then you release a whole bunch of particles into the screen, and based on their current position, they will update what their angle of movement is based on where they are in the grid. And then you kind of get this nice soft movement through. Or based on how you define your noise field, it could be very hard, edgy movements, or kind of whirlpool-y movements. Basically, how you define your noise field and how you interpret those values, you can get lots of varying outputs here. So if we wanted to generate a flow field, I actually have a link here to a sample that I presented to our computing club at GVSU. I just clicked play here on this P5 sketch. You see the flow field being generated, and essentially all it really is a bunch of particles or objects with an XY color representation at minimum, just kind of going through this flow field. And every time I run it, we're going to get a mildly different output. Okay, so this is all based on random noise and essentially angular movement. All right. We also included the drunkard's walk algorithm. This is one where it's typically used for procedural generation. I know there's many, many uses for it in other domains as well. But basically, you have an agent or a particle or some kind of an entity that's going to randomly stumble around, and we're going to follow that path as it goes. And then you'll randomly restart it either at the original location or wherever you want to in your area. There's also dithering that's included. Now, dithering is one where we're reducing the color palette intentionally, so you kind of get throwback style images. Things look a little bit grainier or more pixelated or more crunchy. And then there's the pixel sorting algorithm that I also mentioned. Now, I tend to like glitchy art, which is very good for this project because the outcomes tended towards that aesthetic. But based on how we define our fitness functions, you could probably tweak it to whichever particular output you want. Okay, so that's the art background, and I could probably spend hours talking about that, but I need to move on to the evolutionary side. So we used grammatical evolution for this work. I know that GI is typically in the GP domain. Grammatical evolution tends to fall in the GP area in that we are using grammars instead of tree-based representations. And if you're not familiar with grammatical evolution, basically the operations are fairly similar, mutation, crossover, selection, all of those are there. They're just going to be handled mildly differently because instead of using a tree, we are using essentially a string once our rule set gets flattened. What we really like about GE is that it tends to really constrain the solution space such that you don't get as many invalid outputs as you typically would in GP. I'm aware that there are ways to reduce that ahead of time in the GP space, but this one, at least for us, is really great for representing kind of how our techniques are laid out and how everything is incorporated throughout evolution. Now, the other thing here too, while I'm talking about grammar-based representation, this was our target for GI. So we wanted to improve our genomes over time using evolutionary principles. So we're essentially improving the artistic program that's being generated. Could be a bit of a leap, if you will, but essentially we are optimizing how these drawings are occurring over time. And if you're not familiar with grammars, we follow a BNF style grammar. So this is actually using the tracery library, which I'll talk about momentarily. We have our top level rule here. We have either our stopping point where we have a single technique or a recursive level of techniques. And then we have a list of all of the artistic techniques included in this work. So stippling, flow fields, dithering, all of that would be included in here. And then everything in the ellipses below would be the parameters for those techniques. Okay. So I mentioned tracery. Now this is another library that we use. I'm going to skip ahead one slide here because it's worth talking about. This makes grammar and grammar changing very easy for us. There is JavaScript, Python, Java. I mean, there's any number of languages that this library has been ported to, which is great. But the idea here, this was actually something that I presented a couple of years ago at GI for evolutionary storytelling, basically. And the goal with Tracery is to make it usable for authors. How do we get interesting stories generating? So I'm not going to go deep into this here, but I'm just clicking reroll, which is essentially kind of randomizing our grammar selection here. So there's a whole lot of parameters in this particular grammar, and what you get out of it is a new paragraph. Think of it almost like a Mad Lib style generator. The really nice thing about Tracery, if you are kind of in the space of um, writing stories, it handles gender, plurals, all kinds of different grammar-based things, separate grammar. Okay, so our grammars then, we are going to take, as with most grammars, you're going to flatten the top level rule and then you get a string of outputs from that. Okay, so tracery is going to help us out with the representation. And then once we flatten out our top level rule, we're going to get a list of parameters that get executed in order. So in this case, if we were to flatten this particular grammar, we might run a stippling algorithm, run it again with different parameters, then run a flow field algorithm, and then run a third stippling. Is that the best way to create a piece of art? Maybe, maybe not, right? Depends on the output. However, we now have essentially a program for generating a piece of artwork. Okay. So the last key bit here is that we use lexicase selection for our selection operator. Sorry, for one of our selection operators. We compare it to single objective and random later on. The interesting thing about lexicase is that it's a many objective operator, and it is not Pareto based. What this means is that this is not an SGA2 or an SGA3, but really what happens is that each time that we want to perform selection, we're going to evaluate the candidate individuals based on their objective functions one by one by one. So for instance, if I have a group of individuals, I'm going to compare them all in the first objective. Did they do great? Yes. Is one better? Yes, that's our individual. However, if everybody's the same for this objective, we'll move on to the second objective. Evaluate, evaluate, who's the best here. If we get all the way to the end where there is no clear winner, we'll just pick a random individual. Okay. So this is essentially a very lightweight many objective search, and it's very, very powerful. Now we use a variant called epsilon lexicase selection. Basically this kind of expands on its capabilities. It's very useful in real numbered applications. You tend to see this in robotics a lot. But basically we are looking for values within a range, not necessarily a strict binary, yes, I'm better. So it adds a little bit of flexibility. So the goal here is that we're not really seeing massively observable changes based on some of these real world values. And when you are evaluating on a pixel by pixel basis, that kind of extra granularity is very, very helpful in selection. Okay. So again, to bring us back, the goal here was to apply GI to optimize the grammar that we are generating to create a piece of art. This is going to tend towards glitch art because that's something that I am interested and fascinated by. If you had a different perspective, then we would have to tailor the algorithms to something that your particular preference would be, right? So interestingly enough, glitch art also makes for a great proof of concept because if an image looks broken, then technically it's probably glitch art. But for instance, here is an example of what I mean when I say glitch art. So I have to do this to my own self because I feel really bad breaking other people's faces, for instance, in images. But here's my lovely headshot from work. So here's the original. I then pixel sort it so we kind of play with I think this was just the default mean value of the RGB pixels, and then applying a color shift. So basically separating out the red, green, blue values, moving things around a little bit, and then you get this kind of interesting pop art, glitch art type of situation going on here. something that I like might not necessarily be somebody else's preference, right? So our overall approach is actually pretty straightforward. We take a set of artistic techniques, we include them in the grammar, translate that to our code base, and then run our evolutionary computation on that. So I'll go through each of these fairly quickly here since I'm already starting to run low on time. So first of all, let's say that you wanted to include a new technique into this particular framework, and you have an algorithm that you use. Now we are using Python, um, just for reference here, but let's say that I wanted to add a third flow field. Okay, so it has a type, it's going to take a color palette and a zoom level here, right? So type is an array, palette's an array, the zoom is going to be a real float value, or a real value. Okay, so this would be translated to the grammar by defining the production here. So this is a flow field, it has a type, it has a palette, it has a zoom. These subrules then would be broken down into what values are accepted here. Now, if it's a list or a Boolean, it's very easy to include. It's essentially a very simple list. If it is a numbered value of some kind, it needs to be converted to a string and basically generate a range of values in that list. Not necessarily optimal, but this is how tracery handles numbered values. There's not like a pick a value in this range. You need to break it down into a string in a list. Specific to tracery, I'm sure there's a better way to do that. But that's essentially what's going on here. And then this production rule would be included in the main algorithm. So then this particular flow field algorithm would be included for selection. Right, you also need to translate your technique to our specific area. So basically modify the art function to accept the pillow image object. That's going to be the canvas that it draws upon. And then everything inside of the function should be drawing to that image. And then depending on what you're doing in there, either you return a new image or you allow the user to just kind of draw on that in memory. But minimally, you need to send in the pillow image object there. Okay. Then you configure the search. It's fairly standard for most people at GI, I would assume here. So which selection operator we're using, what are your mutation rate, crossover rate, number of generations, population size, all of that fun stuff that we always do. For this particular work, though, which selection are we doing? If it's many objective that we want to check, we're going to use lexicase selection. So that's the one that I talked about in the background. We compare that with single objective, which just uses tournament selection. And we pick a specific fitness function for that one. Or we compare it to random search for statistical means. All right, the fitness functions that we include here. So we want to minimize the number of duplicate genes in our genome. So we don't want to have 500 stipples, for instance. We'd want to minimize that. We also want to maximize the diversity of the techniques. So basically this kind of gets us to that glitchy space where the more things being drawn, the more messy it looks, the happier I am. But basically kind of the glitchier things look. And then we also want to maximize the pixel differences between the images. And we have two different functions for that. We're going to calculate the root mean square value between two images, basically comparing the pixel values, as well as the Chebyshev algorithm for that as well. And those do very similar things, but you get a slightly different output. So we included both just to try and maximize it as much as possible. Okay. Many objective search will use all four of these here. Single objective search only looks at RMS. And then we simply execute the search. So based on the configuration, we are going to generate a population of essentially, again, art programs to execute. The flattened grammar will be executed in sequence. So we're going to draw a stipple, we'll draw a flow field, then we'll draw a stipple, then we'll dither it, so on and so forth. For this proof of concept that we are doing here, we did not clear the image canvas in between evaluations or in between evolutionary operations. And the goal here was to basically keep building up on the canvas. So pretend like you have a piece of artwork, I pass it to my friend and then they draw on it and then they pass it on and they draw on it. Future work, we're going to clear that out and see how that changes things. But for us, this was giving us the output style that we wanted. Again, this is a very subjective thing to talk about here. Okay. And then after that, you output the best images to your directory. So who won each generation? What is the best out of the final generation? And then you get something that looks, to me, nicely glitchy, aesthetically pleasing here. So this is the result of many generations, well, sorry, 100 generations, 100 population size. And you kind of keep overlaying these things and you get really interesting outputs. So for us, we did 10 replicates. We did 1,000 by 1,000 image size, so fairly small if you're printing, but this is a fairly big array for an algorithm to chunk through, so this took quite a while to run. Um, our crossover rate was 0.5, mutation was 0.4, epsilon was 0.85. We had 4 objectives for Lex case, and that's how we ran our search. Now, what we're looking for mathematically in terms of our output, we wanted to maximize the novelty of our images. So lexicase versus random was statistically significant. Lexicase selection gave us more novel outputs. Single objective versus random also gave us significantly better outputs. Lexicase versus single objective was not statistically significant for this experiment. I would expect with a broader number of fitness functions and maybe tweaking some things, we could actually get a better novelty score with lexicase in the future as well. But for us, we did better than random, which for most statistical measures in evolutionary computation is kind of the gold standard, right? So then in terms of our gene uniqueness, we actually wanted to minimize this value. So if we have a minimized value here, we actually have a more diverse population is how to read this. Interestingly, random does significantly better in this case. And the reason why is that random will select a random number of techniques and it will never evolve because it's more of a one-shot. So in this case, Lex case and single objective both are evolving, evolving, evolving. They're piling on extra techniques and we are losing that diversity a little bit. So what was very interesting for us here is that random gave us better diversity. So that's something that's interesting for future work. So in terms of our discussion, our sample outputs, this is the image from the paper. So here we have our Lex case outputs, random outputs, single objective outputs. Looking at it from this perspective, there's probably hard to see the differences here. But essentially what we're getting out of Lex case and single objective, we tended to converge towards some common suite of techniques per run. Okay, so they would converge, which is great. We wanted to see that. And this results from maximizing the number of techniques, minimizing the number of duplicate genes, maximizing pixel diversity, and that kind of fun stuff. Random search gives us more kind of negative space or blank space in the outputs. So in here, for instance, in this drunkard's walk algorithm only, really, there's a whole lot of negative space, whereas here, every single pixel is doing something. So depending on what you want in terms of an output, you could tweak this algorithm, fairly trivially to get completely different outputs. So overall, I know I'm starting to run a little bit low on time, so I'll go through the related work here quickly. There has been an explosion in generative art through AI. So if you've heard of anything on the internet these days in terms of Stable Diffusion, Midjourney, DALL-E, VQGAN, and Clip, these are all those generative adversarial networks where they're taking a massive data set and based on a prompt, stitching together some sort of output, whether it be text or images or video or anything, right? So this is a huge thing right now. It also requires a massive amount of computing power, a massive data set going into it, and then you get really interesting outputs and quite frankly, incredible outputs, right? For us, we wanted to focus on a specific suite of techniques and then let the evolutionary process go from there. So parallel development areas. However, in this case, we are fighting against the current trend on the internet, right? So we also only need processing power to run essentially evolutionary search versus massive cloud data center. Okay. There are also many other examples of creative coding and generative art and visualization. It's a big area for explaining data or for basically visualizing anything, creating game environment worlds, all kinds of different things that you could be using generative art for. We were interested in fine-tuning the interaction between techniques and creating aesthetically pleasing outputs. Interestingly, we found a taxonomy of fitness metrics for art/music, and we figure that we could use that in our future work to basically expand our fitness functions. But this type of research is absolutely wonderful for, say, including human preference in your outputs. Okay, so again, we are looking for more fitness functions for future work. We're also going to include additional techniques. So how many things can we essentially pack in here to get unique and interesting outputs? The other bit, which is probably going to be the hardest thing, is how do we get a human in the loop? What is a good output? What does aesthetic preference mean? I like glitch art. Maybe you like standard, not standard, maybe you like more traditional art or more Renaissance art or pop art, any kind of an artistic preference. How in the world do you measure that on a person by person basis? So that's going to be another subject of future work as well. Okay, with that, we would like to thank Grand Valley State University and the Michigan Space Grant Consortium for their generous support for this work. And since we are remote, I will be happy to take any questions by email, I suppose. But other than that, thank you all for having us again, and I look forward to talking with you through Zoom. Thanks, everybody.